the most parts of Africa, for the most of Africa, we have the nature or the structures of our migration patterns make it generally very difficult to pin a particular group and say these groups are indigenous to they're indigenous people within this particular area. Again, I go back to the Obudu people, where I am from, a minority group in the southern part of Nigeria. There have been a lot of moves, even within the last 100 years. Where the Obudu people are living now is not where they lived 100 years ago. There was a big migration. So they moved to this present area. So it becomes very tricky when we think of this idea of indigenous people within the African context. And I personally don't think that's a very good term to identify groups within Africa. But we also see that, so like I mentioned, the Niger Delta, even though the Obudu people are from the Niger Delta area, they're not from the oil producing area of the Niger Delta, right? But groups from the oil producing area and more educated groups tend to make this case of their indigeneity and why they should have certain protections of indigenous people. And here we begin to see the very political aspect of it. And following the UN declaration on 2007, I believe, on indigenous people, we see all of these groups, some of these groups within Africa begin to make that case for protection. Basically, they are making the case because of the marginalization that they face within their countries. And we can't deny that there are problems of marginalization. If you're from a minority group, you could experience some form of marginalization from dominant ethnic groups within Africa. So it's more of a political, I think it's more of a political response to issues or problems they are facing within their nation state. And this was something that even African leaders were very much concerned. I know Nigeria was one of those countries when the UN was passing, they were making this declaration, discussing this declaration on human rights. A lot of African countries were very concerned. Nigeria, more specifically, was very concerned because you think of the number of ethnic groups that are within Nigeria, and each one of them is saying, we are an indigenous people, we need certain levels of protection, and we need self-determination. And that was a key word that some of these African countries were very worried. So even in the draft-aid memoir that the African group within the UN drafted, they had problems with that terminology of self-determination for indigenous people. Just when they're trying to hold up these European creation and nation states in Africa with multiplicities of ethnic groups, the language of self-determination is a problem. It's going to have an impact on the integrity of nation states within Africa. So I'm just going to keep my comments there for now, and then maybe later I will say more. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Becker. I will introduce Dr. Becker as well. He's the Associate Professor of History and the Associate Director of the Center for Gender and Intercultural Studies at the State University of New York. I'm going to sorry, I forgot to add this at the beginning of the session, that this is the first session. And so all the panelists will give 10 to 20 minutes talk, and then we'll have a second session where we'll invite the audience to have their questions as well that they would like the panelists to address. Housekeeping over there. And so now we go to Dr. Kelechi, who's a lecturer at the Department of Archaeology and Tourism at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, Nigeria, and he's up next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tokyo, and thank you, ICOMOS Nigeria, for bringing this meeting together. I think I would like us to have this conversation as Africans with the knowledge of the complex nature of nation states in Africa, which is quite different from the modern nation states in the colonial Africa. So, of course, I will agree with Beke that Africa, we have actually argued against the concept of indigeneity. But in the real sense, can we completely deny that fact that even before colonialism, that there were a kind of internal migration from one ethnic group to another, or from one culture into another? If you look at the areas around Southern Africa, the indigenous San group have moved from East Africa down to Southern Africa, and within that region, they have moved around. And some are arguing that, of course, because they are moving, probably they must have intruded into some other people's land. I would like to take this conversation from three perspectives.
Okay.
Loosely of enunciation, Ingo, and what are called territorial communion. I will take into the people to land, and this came as a result of people intruding in and probably subjecting them into all sorts of colonialism and empire building. But if we move this down to, for example, the Igbo society in southeastern Nigeria, we have had this kind of situation where you see people moving into land, kingdoms like Yala Kingdom, kingdoms, Benin Kingdom.
Looks like we've lost Dr. Kelechi there. Okay. We may have to go to the next speaker, and I hope Conrad is ready. And then we can take Dr. Kelechi again. And so let's introduce Dr. Wait, I think Dr. Kelechi is back. I'll just check. Yes, he seems to be back. All right, we can't hear Dr. Kelechi, so I think I'll just go ahead and get Conrad to talk about.
I think I was on mute.
Oh, you were, okay.
Oh.
So do you want to continue? Hello?
Okay. Yes, sorry about that. I think the network here is very bad, and I just have to make do with what is available here.
All right, it's okay. Okay, you can go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Oh no, we can't.
Okay, so the idea of indigeneity.
Yeah, good evening.
Is
it's
still about land and access to heaven. Is it that bad now?
Can you switch off your your video, so maybe it will be easier for you to speak, right? Do you want to try that?
Yeah, try that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Is your video,
Can you
is
hear
your
me?
video off?
Yes, the video is off.
Okay, all right, so you can continue now.
Okay, so I was trying to explain that the idea of indigeneity is, in my understanding, is just, it must be about the experience, the kind of experience that people, the Latinos, the Americans, or Aboriginals, and someone in Australia had a kind of different here in Africa. Therefore, people are recognized and people belong to a particular group, an independent village, based on what they have. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. You can continue.
Hi, can you still hear me?
Yes, I'm trying to switch everyone's video off so that it can be clear for everyone to hear, okay? Okay, you can go ahead. Okay, it looks like Dr. Kelechi is having problems. What I'll do is I'll give out the PowerPoint presentation, right, to everyone. I'll send that out. And if you just want to do, like, summarize a bit, Kelechi, Dr. Kelechi, if you want to summarize, and then we can go to the next speaker, and then we can give the PowerPoint presentation to everyone who's attended.
Okay, that's fine.
Do you want to summarize?
So you can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay, so even though we do not have a complete similar experience with the Latinos and some other indigenous people across the world, what I think I will agree with in Africa is what Francis Nyamjo called the flexible indigeneity, where people have moved into particular independent villages or communities and have also moved out. And people had that free movement to belong or not to belong. But in the slide which I was sharing, you'll find out that there is this group of people. For you to belong, you have to be identified as coming from a particular descent. And if you do not belong to that descent, one or another known descent within a locality, what I've called territorial communion, if you do not belong, then you are not considered a member of that society. And for that, you are not given a right. And for the Igbo, by that identification, you have access to rights to heritage. Each lineage or descent controls a particular heritage that are collectively owned by the people. So this kind of indigeneity is quite different from these other indigenities across the world, where you have this free movement, people can belong and decide not to belong. But in most cases, what communities or villages did in the past and are still doing in the places we have studied is that you have to offer something in order to be accepted into a particular group, and not that kind of forceful belonging that maybe the colonial approach used, or the forceful belonging that the Fulanis are trying to push many groups in Nigeria to allow them settle in the land. So the kind of indigeneity there is different. So my summary is that, of course, the colonial nation states in Africa will not accept the idea of indigeneity. But in the real sense, there are local struggle to land, and there are local struggle to survival. which can lead us to the question of indigeneity in Africa. Thank you. I think again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And my apologies for the connectivity, but we will be sharing the presentation to everyone. So if you leave your email address, and then I can send you the presentation and most of the presentations from this webinar series to everyone. Thank you. And so our next speaker is architect Conrad, and he's a principal of the Atfield Institute of Design and the director of Kuzuka Designs in Uganda. So, hi, Conrad.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. I hope I'm visible. I hope you can all hear me. Good evening from Uganda. It's 8 p.m. this side, or 20 hours somewhere else. Let's talk about this topic because it's one of those things that I have been passionate about for some time. Although here we look at it in a cultural, or we look at it from a cultural point of view, how architecture culturally. If we look at Africa in general, and if we look at even our localized settlements in Uganda, and even back home in our villages, the architecture used or prevalent in those spaces is very temporary. And if something is temporary in nature, it is going to lack the longevity or even the evidence, of existence. And that always calls the question of what is authentic, what is indigenous to either Africa or Uganda in this perspective. When we started this conversation, we were looking at a case study, and I hope Toki has the details, images of the Kasubi tombs. These are tombs that were built about 100 years ago as a burial ground for one of the local kingdoms back home. And for the last 100 years, it has been maintained, or they've used the same ideals in terms of materiality, in terms of aesthetic. They've used sort of the same mechanisms in trying to maintain. But one of the challenges that has been coming up is every time somebody is angry, every time there's a strike, the tombs go up in flames, and before you know it, everything is back to ground zero. The Kasubi tombs have been burnt down not once, not twice, but in the last 10 years, in the last decade, we've had about 3 or 4 incidences of fires burning down the tombs. So now the question of what is indigenous, do we maintain or preserve the old methods and the old materiality to capture the spirit and the essence of what is African, or do we insist on new approaches, new technologies, new designs to still preserve or encapsulate the ideals, the philosophies, the methodologies, of that architecture in what our present day environment is. And so for me, the conversation, especially when it comes to African indigeneity, its need to be preserved, its aspects is to understand critically what the fabric of African indigeneity is, what aspects of it can be transformed, what aspects of it can be sort of replicated to either represent the times or revised down to the artistry, down to the methodology, down to the skill. In the case example I've been sharing about the Kasubi tombs, it is the only UN heritage site in Uganda that we have. And one of the things that I found interesting is that the artisans of the tombs are selected from a particular clan within the kingdom, and no one else other than those people are supposed to build or even have association with building such a masterpiece of architecture. And so it begs the question of how do you preserve a culture that is defined on following ideals that are not progressive, or in this case, are not evident? Because you see, one of the things is there's no written or there is no data on the particular preservation methods, on the particular stylistic methods, on the particular material methods, on the particulars of the architecture. And yet, you know, after 100 years also, the architecture that is supposed to represent a culture, that is supposed to represent a people, you get it, yes, is being passed down verbally or orally from one clan, you know, one chief of the clan to another, to probably the next one, you know. So that for me is the space where we need to start having that conversation. It's a space of understanding what our cultural fabrics are, what the artistry and the intangible elements are, because those intangibilities are what is indigenous to us. It's, you know, it's what and I think now more than these practices, these conversations need to be recorded. Otherwise, without evidence, without fact, or without any data, you get it over time, the conversation on what is indigenous and what has changed is going to be very, very difficult. Because if you look at the pre-colonial archetypes, if you look at the colonial archetypes, and then if you look at the post-colonial archetypes in Uganda and in most third world countries, they're quite similar. And somehow that these have been adopted as our own, and which I find quite interesting. One of the conversations I was having, and as a teacher at Artfield, was the corridor that is a common archetype in Africa does not work. You get it. The orientation of most spaces, especially colonial buildings, does not work because I mean, you have the evening sun, and yet the evening sun is the hottest sun you'll spend a night in a room that is, you know, literally boiling. And so I believe that to know what is indigenous to us, to have the conversation about what is indigenous to us, to better understand our cultural fabric, our indigeneity, our intangibility, the first conversation that needs to be had is the recording and documentation of this evidence, of this artistry, and these practices. And when these practices are passed down, when this information is passed down over time, we can now start to authenticate we can start to authenticate whether it is indigenous to us, or it's indigenous to the times, or is not. And for me, that is the conversation, that is the mentality, that is the space we are in. That is a conversation right now that needs to be had. And then we can start to evolve, because the conversation I'm having now is going to be, and is evident in other aspects of African spaces, African cities, especially pre-colonial, post-colonial, colonial and post-colonial. I mean, the evidence is there that most of our architecture, our cultural fabric and artistry is in the intangible aspects of our lifestyle, our personalities, our music, our food, which is very difficult to be encapsulated in design, but can be symbolized, can be represented, and better still, if documented, can start the conversation and understanding what the fabric of indigenous architecture, or whatever it is, means to Africans, is to Africans, and can be applied. And it's something that would benefit greatly learning. Other than that, the conversation is going to be one that is very recurring in terms and aspects of where we see ourselves and where we see ourselves going. What is authentic today, whether it will be authentic tomorrow, what is relevant today and how relevant it is tomorrow. You know, if we look at, just giving just a general example, in this new age, there's been a lot of intermarriages, especially in our young youth, and these intermarriages have also started to create what I would call a new culture, because you know the traditional wedding is very sentimental to most African cultures. It's one of those practices that is consistent even beyond, or you know, even when you go for the modern wedding, one of the things that is encouraged is the traditional wedding first, and yet with these new intermarriages, and it is creating a new sort of style. It's adapting to several cultures and viewing so many cultures. So if something as small and as minute as that can have such a large impact, you can imagine what it would mean to understand, in case in point, the Kasui tombs that have been around for 100 years. What stories have not been documented? What evidence or fact has not been documented over the last 100 years? And the conversation, I think, right now would even be much more different if there was data, if there was facts, if there was evidence, if there was recording of the artistry, of the knowledge, of what exactly the fabric and the aspects of indigeneity are to the people,
right.
both back home in Uganda and as a whole. And I think for me, just a few closing remarks. The conversation right now is, yeah,
Yes,
just a few remarks. The conversation right now is to and detail what our cultural fabric is, how it's moved and evolved, and then we can then start have definitions, defined elements of what exactly that is, and then when we have and encourage what we understand as Africanicity as a collective and as a movement that is going to change the landscape, that is going to change the conversation, that is going to define the people, who they are and what they are and who they aspire to be. Yes, thank you very much. I hope I was audible. I hope you are all able to listen in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Conrad. I will be introducing the next.
Toki.
Thank you. The next panelist, which is Ms. Tolu Omoyele. She is a PhD candidate at the London College of Fashion, University of Arts, UK, and an African fashion curator, director of Fashion PR. Hello, Ms. Tolu.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, super. Thank you, Toki, for organizing this and moderating. So, where do I start? Dr. Kleji mentioned some really interesting points, and so has Conrad. And I guess I should start by reiterating what Conrad said. He did mention something about intangible cultural elements and how the intangible cultural elements are indigenous to us. But one of the challenges of locating which indigenous cultural elements in terms of stylistics and aesthetics are indigenous to African people is the fact that there is a lack of documentation and recording of what these practices are. And also because of the colonial history, because of the globalization, we can't really tell what is indigenous in terms of the intangible cultural elements. So it's in line with this that I have prepared my presentation. So I'm drawing from my research of Africa Fashion Week London, where I interrogate and examine the uses of dress and design practices by African, specifically Nigerian designers in staging cultural identities. I'm in my final year writing up my research, but when Toki talked about indigeneity, the first thing that came to mind was some of the design practices that I had observed since African Fashion Week started in 2011. I'm not going to bore you by, talking about what it started out to do and all that, but basically African Fashion Week as a concept started initially in New York. It was founded by Adiat Disu, a Yoruba Nigerian American woman. And the reason why she founded it was because she said there was a lack of representation of Black and African designers and models within the fashion industry. Subsequently, it moved to Dublin, and then thereafter, it moved to London in 2011. So African Fashion Week, the concept has proliferated all around the diaspora. And in 2015, the organizers of African Fashion Week London decided to host a African Fashion Week Nigeria. And since then, it has, it's become one of the largest events you would attend in terms of fashion. And the reason why they do this is because, again, they feel like African fashion is not generating, although African fashion is generating enough publicity. A lot of designers are using what they term as African fashion, which would be African print and stuff. And that Western designers are also commodifying and appropriating, commercializing African fashion styles and aesthetics. Whereas the African descended designers themselves were often excluded from within this fashion circuit and the fashion discourse. So the reason what African Fashion Week London proposes to do is to give a stage for and a platform for the promotion of design and dress aesthetics by African designers from Africa. And I think this fits well into this topic of indigeneity and indigenous practices, because no one can do African fashion better than African people. So my research at African Fashion Week London shows that there are, when we're talking about indigeneity, we can see it at play at African Fashion Week in several ways. And one of the ways is through the designers. Some designers, they incorporate indigenous material culture into their brand messaging. So one of the designers that I can think of that started incorporating the traditional Yoruba textile called Ashoke in its design practices is a photographer turned designer named called Tunde Owolabi. Another designer who also incorporates, indigenous traditional Xhosa materials into his design practices is a designer called Laduma. I can't pronounce his last name, but it's Ngxokolo. He also incorporates a traditional Xhosa material culture and practices into his design, into his brand. Also at African Fashion Week, we will find like vendors and marketers. These are people who act as middlemen and middle women who are circulating, the indigenous products that has been made by African people from, let's say, Uganda, Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, wherever. They come to African Fashion Week bringing all this, exclusive products and commodities that you would not find on the high street in the UK. Then finally, we have the fabric producers. These are the makers and producers of fabric, such as the Ashoke Adire. What is really interesting about the fabric producers showcasing at African Fashion Week London is the fact that a lot of them come from China, they're European, and this fits into the conversation surrounding what is African fashion, what is African about African print. And then when I'm thinking about indigenous indigeneity and indigenous practices in relation to existing conversation around fashion, it kind of gets really complicated, because number one, historically, we have traditional fabrics such as the ashoke and adire that has been made like in Southwest by Yoruba people in Nigeria. And now, because of, let's say, because of globalization, you have an increased competition from China and other European countries who are now making this traditional, fabric. So the question then becomes, what happens to the local weavers and textile makers from, let's say, Nigeria or in Kwara State or in whatever states that you can think of? So one of the ways in which African Fashion Week London, the organizers of, one thing that they came up with to mitigate against the domination of the market by Chinese-made and European-made ashoke and adire is through, sorry, where is it? Okay, one of the ways in which they mitigate against this is in 2020, in September 2020, African Fashion Week London, in association with the Kwara State First Lady, Dr. Folake Abdulrazak, they presented a fashion film documentary at the Sustainable Fashion Week. And the medium of fashion film was employed as a means to document, again, reiterating what Conrad said about the lack of documentation of African practices and intangible culture. So they used the fashion film documentary as a way to document, record, and circulate information about indigenous clothing and dress practices as found in Kwara State and broadly in Nigeria. And the documentary film also highlighted the existence of a textile, weaving, and clothing manufacturing industry in Kwara. The reason why I think this is relevant is because when you talk about places where fashion is made, you would never think of Kwara State, you would never think of made in Nigeria. As a matter of fact, when I spoke to some of my informants at African Fashion Week London, whom I interviewed for my research, they said one of the perceptions about African fashion, or especially clothing made in Nigeria, that they have to overcome is this idea that it doesn't have the quality. Basically, the clothing made in Africa is of low quality, is inferior. So that's one of the perceptions that they have to overcome, and they're doing. And how that perception got out there, I don't know. But anyway, so the documentary film made by African Fashion Week London and the Kwara State First Lady is, a way to record and document the existence of this tacit knowledge of the Kwara State weavers, and that they are weavers in Kwara State with amazing weaving techniques, and that not everything is made in China. And I think that's one way in which African Fashion Week London and its organizers intervenes in fashion media discourse about what fashion is in Africa and what African contributions to fashion has been. Right. So my understanding, just to sum up, my understanding of indigeneity is quite simple yet complex. I read several articles about what it means to be indigenous, and I'm going by the dictionary's definition, which says it means born or produced naturally in a land or a region. So when people talk about being indigenous or something, they tend to focus on other people, and very few or limited attention has been paid to, practices originated from a place. And just as people were born in regions and lands across the world, so are practices and ideas. And these practices are produced or developed in response to challenges in the specific environment. So the Yoruba practice of weaving cloth into ashoke is a dress practice that is specific to the Yoruba, to a specific Yoruba family. But over time, it became associated with the Yoruba culture and became known as a Nigerian fabric. So to conclude, it's like when we're talking about indigeneity in relation to fashion and dress, we there's so many layers that has to be unraveled, and one way in which I think this idea of indigeneity is being explored or approached that I can think of in relation to my research would be through African Fashion Week and what they're doing, and the fact that designers from Congo, Cameroon, Ethiopia, even the Caribbean, they go to African Fashion Week to present the latest collections and the latest styles. It could be argued that that's a form of indigenous practice and indigenous, you know, tacit knowledge, you know. So that concludes my talk. I hope it's been as exciting as it has been for me.
All right. So thank you, everybody, everyone, and thank you to the panelists. And I would like to throw in my 1 or 2 cents into this discourse. And one of the things that usually comes up is that, okay, the tensions become more intense when the focus is on the diasporic and on enslaved descendants. So does this context render African indigeneity impossible or simply non-existent? So what would be your take on it? So I'm asking each one of you. So what would be your take on it, and what do you think this means within the indigeneity context? You know, how do you translate this from an African perspective?
I think for me, I still have a problem with that word, indigenous, most especially when applied to Africa. I have a problem with that word, again, because it's political. It's a word that outsiders primarily came up with, and using it within this global context. And we also have to be careful so it doesn't also become one of those essentialist ways of looking at things, or stereotypes. And just like we had the previous words like third world, primitive, you know, things like that, where they begin to define a certain people by their social conditions, right? So in the terms of Africans in diaspora, again, if we take this word again in its global literary meaning, you know, as being associated with first people living in a certain title land, you know, then you can think of like diasporic Africans, let's say in America, as being indigenous to these particular spaces, because again, they were brought from elsewhere to these specific lands. But could you speak of them as being indigenous to Africa? Yes, but then the problem becomes, can we tie them to specific land in Africa? You see where it becomes very problematic to use this particular term of indigenous, you know, to use globally and to describe people. Again, it's very, very political, and we see it in the context of Africa, the context of Nigeria, that this term is very political, and I think it will create more tensions than actually helping to heal the divides that we already have as a result of our balkanization.
Does anyone want to take that question as well?
Yeah. I hope my network will allow me this time. So yes, I think first of all, I will keep saying that it's not because people we are having this essentialist perspective of stereotyping people with the concept of indigenous or indigeneity. I think we shouldn't run away from what is a historical reality. For instance, I keep mentioning the idea of being attached to land and how people return because they are attached to land. There was this publication by Ashton Sinamai where he was making a point that amongst the Ashanti, amongst the Sami, some Zimbabwean ethnic groups, and even amongst the Igbo, when a child is born, the umbilical cord is buried in a land. And that point of burial of that umbilical cord becomes your point of contact. Each time you move out, you tend to return because you belong to that locality. And that's part of what I call territorial communion, where our living are printed on the landscape. And no matter how far we go, how distance we move, we tend to return to that locality. Let me relate this to the idea of Africans who are enslaved and some others who have moved and settled elsewhere. I am aware that the idea of DNA checking recently is to trace back someone's genealogical origin. And I'm also aware that many people, many enslaved Africans in America have returned to Nigeria, specifically Igbo land, specifically Yoruba land, trying to identify where they came from. If we try to deny the fact that this is a reality, then why are they struggling to trace back their descent, trying to look back to Africa to identify specific places from where they came from? So this is a global issue, but I will keep saying that there are local perspectives to this. There are local migrations that happened where people moved from one place to another. But the question is that if you move to a land and go to join people and you are not accepted into that land, there are some cultural rights. This is where heritage comes in. You don't have rights to particular aspects of heritage in that locality, no matter how long you live there. You don't have rights to a particular, but if you exhibit indigeneity that Francis Nyamjo mentioned, if you have traveled with something, some innovative ideas, you will be welcomed, and there will be a ritual process of accepting you into that locality. And once that happens, so the Igbo, there's a shrine called Al. Al is the earth goddess. So what it means is that you have been introduced into the cosmos of earth goddess, which guides the locality within which people are settled. And this moves from one Igbo independent state to another. And when I say one Igbo independent state to another, for instance, in Southeastern Nigeria, we have 5 states. In each state, we have more than 200 independent villages, and each of them has annual, what I might call the departure of the earth, or the face of the earth, or the beginning of the earth. So once you are ritualized into the cosmos of Allah, then you belong to that locality. But if this did not happen, then it becomes difficult to accept you, and you will keep coming and going. And when they sit, like one of the pictures I was trying to show, is an annual meeting that happens once in that particular independent village in Urugu, in southeastern Nigeria, where every lineage that has been identified, that accepted into the cosmos of Allah, the earth goddess, will align once every year to that arena to have that meeting. If you have not been accepted, you don't attend that meeting. So no matter how you push, you cannot attend that meeting. Thank you. I think this might give clearer perspective.
All right, I just want to ask a question. So in other words, does it mean that, I do know that there are different Igbo clans, right? So does that mean this particular clan you're talking about is more indigenous to the other clans, the other Igbo clans around that clan?
Yeah, what I'm trying to explain here is that within their locality, they are independent of another. If you move from their locality into another, you will identify that they have their cultural rights that are within their locality, which probably might relate or might not relate to the next independent village. So in this case, trying to cross boundary into from one independent village into another might be very problematic. And that was the reason why we had so many internal wars before colonialism, where you try to move into someone's land and you will be resisted. So these are complex issues, and I think we might not have time to take care of all within here.
All right, so I will throw in one more question, and then I'll take questions from the audience because I can see that the chat box is piling up with questions. So bear with me, I just have one more, and then I'll go take the questions in the chat box. Okay, so will tangible and intangible aspects of African indigeneity mean built environment, sites, personal and symbolic meanings of regions or kinships within African cultural landscapes, or is there more to it? Or do we reclaim Pan Africanism as our goal, or do we have an idea of what we want to be identified with, bearing all this in mind? And don't forget, we also have people that are diasporic and have been taken out of Africa as enslaved peoples to other regions. So I'm trying to tie in all of this. What do you think?
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I think without the locality, even if you remove locality from Africans, and this goes to the greater diaspora or people that are enslaved or anything, culture has identity. And if you have a culture, you have an identity. Now, if you look at our spaces or our conversation around what it means or what indigeneity means, I think it has a lot to do with identity. You get it? And understanding that identity and understanding what that identity means, and knowing that that identity does not make me lesser or better than someone. You get it? And what has happened is, because of lack of documentation, some of our cultural practices have been looked down or frowned upon. Juju is looked down as something negative or bad or poor, and it's emphasized, and yet it was a significant part of our spirituality. When you look at just back home, when you look at the tribal, structure, having a clan meant you had an identity and a space that would represent who you are or would define who you are as a person, and that should be well respected and very evident in our spaces. It's something that we can't or we shouldn't even try to downplay or take away from. And that's why I'm saying I think greatly that before we speak about Pan-Africanism, before we think about the global picture, first is to sort of glorify and sort of emphasize our cultures, our practices, and have evidence and fact. Because when there's no evidence and fact, then something very interesting is locally, months here, even before you had November, December, whatever it is, months here were seasonal and were seasonal to particular things that happened within the environment. The rainy season around the tropics brings a lot of grasshoppers and white ants. And so the month here is not called November, it's actually called or named locally as the grasshopper month. So when you hear people say musenene, which is the local term for the grasshopper, which is a delicacy here, that is the month, the 11th month of the year, if you get it. So I feel like those things need to be well documented and evident, because when we don't talk about them, when we don't have that identity, it won't matter whether we're indigenous to an area or because even if you look at our culture, we never settled those. If the reason why there is no physical evidence or
Okay, it looks like we've lost Conrad. Does anybody want to chime in before I take the questions from the audience?
Especially on the small scale archetype or archaeology, is because people moved or
Can I take from the panelists before I take questions from the audience? Who wants to round that up?
Hello?
Yes?
All right.
So if everyone can put their questions on the chat box, it will be easier for me to, because we only have 30 minutes left.
Hello.
So if you can put your questions on the chat box, I'll read it out so that we keep the time. Okay, thank you. So do the panelists want to finish that off before I take the questions?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sorry, Prof.
Right.
The only thing I just wanted to say is I can appreciate the professor's point. I mean, being an historian, that the word creates tensions. You can't describe a large group of people like the African people, even Nigerian people themselves as using one word, like, oh, we're indigenous. And so yeah, in some sense I can understand and I appreciate the fact that it doesn't really capture the different realities, of the African people. And I can also appreciate Dr. Kelechi's point that about the indigenous as someone or a situation or condition where you have an attachment to the land. And the only thing I would like to add to that is diaspora and continental Africans, they all have different experiences, and the experiences of diasporans and continentals are equally valid. We shouldn't be continuing this practice of juxtaposing or pitting Africans in diaspora against Africans on the continent to see whether some of the concepts that we use in relation to describing continental Africans would apply to diasporan experience, because those are totally different concepts and experiences. And also, no culture is fixed, because culture is something that's continuously changing. It's in the process of becoming, according to Stuart Hall. And the fact is, globalization is a powerful force that has created conditions for hybridity, cross-cultural interactions, and moving from one place to another. And we see this all the time, where people adopt practices that are maybe found in some village in Nigeria, for example. And then when those people from that village, let's say in Ondo State or whatever, they migrate from Ondo State and they go to Lagos State, they take with them the cultural practices and habits that they've been conditioned to have or socialized to have as, growing up in Ondo State, and then they take it to Lagos, or they take it to London, or they take it to wherever. And that's how, that culture is moving and changing. So that's all I just wanted to say.
Yeah, but the question of indigeneity or indigenous practices is tied to land, right? So if it's tied to land, how do you travel with land to wherever it is you're going to? So that's the issue I have with the word indigenous, right? So
sorry,
it displaces people, sort of, if they're like the enslaved that we have, outside of Africa, and also diasporans as well. So if it's tied to land, then it's a problem. So is it that it's not part of our intrinsic, behavior or beings? Are we divorcing that?
Well, if you ask the South Africans, it would be really interesting if we had a South African panelist, because they can tell you about the fact that South Africa is controlled, the land is dominated by 100% by, the white South Africans. And most of the times they've always said the identity is, to the land, but they've been completely cut off from the land because they don't own the land. So yeah, I guess the term should be reconsidered and maybe disposed of, or come up with something else that's, that fully encapsulates the realities of where we are as Africans.
And I think also just to add to that, and also in response to Kelechi, and I also see there's a question in the chat about this as well. So how far do we go, right? So if you're thinking about, let's say, the Igbo people bearing an umbilical cord today, you are thinking, is this a practice that is 300, 400, 500 years old since the origins of the Igbo people, or is this a new practice? And if you put that in the context of migration, I don't know whether this is whether you subscribe to this, but I know there's also a big section of the Igbo population who also believe that they migrated from Israel, right? So are they indigenous to Nigeria, or are they indigenous to Israel? See where it gets more complicated when we think of these things. Yeah. Either.
All right, so I think Deirdre is there, so I'm going to ask Deirdre to ask her question, because she's posted a few remarks on the chat box, and I wanted to know if she had a question directly that she wanted to ask one of you. So is Deirdre here?
Yep, I'm here. Okay, I'm very interested in your discussion.
Okay.
But I really feel I should take a back seat rather and listen and not be but I just do wonder whether if I can ask this one question. I think Chilangwa mentioned it. Tolope, you've also mentioned the idea of land ownership. I think indigeneity isn't necessarily about land ownership. If I use a parallel to our own situation, Indigenous people were dispossessed of their land, but that act of dispossession doesn't make them any less Indigenous to their locality. So maybe it's less about land, tied to land, it's more tied to location and to all the cultural attributes that implies. So question whether.
So to the panelists?
Yeah, please.
Go on, Conrad.
What I find very interesting about African, if you talk about African indigeneity and practices, one of the things that you're going to find is that it has little to do with the land and more to do with the people. Because it's in the food, it's in the dance, it's in the clothing, it's in the practices. You get it? And so sometimes the land, as evidenced in terms of locality, is important, but that does not remove or take away that Africanist. Let me even move from the word indigeneity and go to Africanicity, because one of the things that I find interesting is that even if you looked at people in the diaspora, is that as long as you're from a particular tribe, you're going to practice elements and attributes and aspects. You're going to prepare food from that particular area that you like to prepare. I mean, it's just finding out where to get that food. You're going to dress, so you're going to understand how to dress. You're going to speak. You're going to identify. And I feel that for me is very fundamental. And in celebrating and magnifying that, even the land does not take that aspect away from us. And for me, I feel that it's the killing of the culture that's where we start to lose the intrinsic aspects. It's the dumbing down of our cultures, of our practices, that we start to lose what we understand or our identity. You get it? Whether the land is there or not, if the people and the culture are or if there is nothing about the people and the culture, then it's going to be very difficult to have the conversation about what indigeneity is. And so it's understanding that cultures are evolving, but there is the authenticity, there is things that you cannot change, and it's in understanding that maybe we can start to encapsulate what it is, what it means to be Ugandan, what it means to be from my village, what it means to be African. You get it? Fundamentally. But again, the conversation around land simply means that without the land, are we still the people? And with the land, are we still the same people? You know, those are other conversations, or that's another conversation that is going to come into play. Bear in mind, like I said in my earlier presentation, is that our practices or our architecture is intangible. Yes. And for me, that has to be recorded. Yeah. If you look at our fashion, it's an intangible. It's something that was spoken about and told. And so is there evidence of that? You get it? And because there's no evidence of that, that leads to this conversation of what exactly it is to be African, what exactly it is to identify as African.
Okay, does anyone want to chime in?
I'm just going to add briefly to what Conrad has already said. I think in the African context, again, because of our migration patterns, I think it will be very problematic to attach it to land. We can attach it to both our cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, but not necessarily to land.
Yeah. Okay.
I just, let me just add
Just
briefly,
wanted to say something important here. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Kelechi. Go ahead.
Okay, so there is one thing I think that is going on here. We are looking at Africa as a monolithic entity, where we are looking at Africa as a whole and one thing. And I think this is problematic because if we talk about Africa, it's a complex place to discuss. Let me take it bit by bit. If you come down to Nigeria, we have more than 250 ethnic diversities in Nigeria. And these people have their different ways of doing things, which you cannot juxtapose one with another because they have the tangible aspect of their culture and the intangible aspect, which give roots to how they understand their belonging within their location. I will take us to two examples, one in Ghana and one in Zimbabwe. The Ghana one is about the Dokoyama people, who lived around the Biu, the River Volta area of Biu. There was a dam that was going to go through that village, and they were asked to move. And they said, no, we can't move until we move with our ancestors. And they were asked, if you are to move with your ancestors, what are you supposed to do? And they requested that they have to exhume their ancestors, exhume their shrines, and too many things that they have deposited on the landscape, and ritualize them in their new location. And that's the only way they can leave that location. This is one. Then another, the Kami World Heritage Site in Zimbabwe. If you have read the Uninherited Past by Ashton Sinamai, you'll understand that the Zimbabwean state took over Kami. But after a long time, because it was aware of nationalizing Zimbabwe, then the leadership of the nation wasn't taking care of the site. And because the people have been distanced, then the people are also not taking care of the site. So at that stage, that's where now Sinamai argued about uninherited past. So if you look at this, you find out that no matter how we argue about this, the African context is quite different from other people. There is this serious attachment to land in relation to where you are, whom you are, and where you speak from. That's the point I was trying to make about loci of enunciation by Walter Mignolo. Where do you stand to speak from? So, well, that's fine, but we continue with the conversation, but I just wanted to make this clear. Thank you.
All right, so I have the ICOMOS president, Aliyah Budu, on whose hand has been raised for a while now, so he wants to speak. So I'm going to let him have his word or his comments, questions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And sorry for catching up late because I've been trying to link up, but I have been facing some challenges with my network. But just to say a word, just to follow up with the conversation on indigeneity, especially considering the different cultural representations in Africa concerning relationship to lands and the dynamic nature of culture. I just want to hint, just to follow up with, just to agree with the two last previous speakers, that the fact of the matter mostly with indigeneity within the African context, leaves out mainly the
Hello? Hello?
It's gone.
He's gone?
He's mute.
He's on mute?
Yeah, he's muted, right?
All right, okay, while we wait for him, can Francesca, who's asking questions in the chat box, ask her questions as well? Francesca?
Yes, hi. Yeah, I was just saying that in the conversation, it really feels like it seems as if we are going backwards and we're having the same conversation. And I was just speaking with a friend that's with me now from Namibia, and she was explaining to me how even in the fashion sense of Namibian fashion, how when the Germans took over, their whole sense of fashion and the tradition and the culture of what they were wearing before the Germans took over was completely taken from them, and it changed, and they don't even have that left. And so it's just like it's a repetitive cycle. And like, how do we turn back? Because it seems like we are having these same conversations and we as Africans are stuck. So how do we get out of the mud is my question.
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you, and thank you for recounting your experience with your Namibia friend. Well, one of the ways that I think, the issue of cultural appropriation is so huge. Well, it depends on which angle you're coming from, and one of the ways in which we can do this is again by documenting, recording. But that's not even enough when you consider the history of Namibia and the fact that the minority had to exert dominance over the majority. And that's something that we found when you look at fashion more closely and you look at fashion history. Clothing is a tool, it's an instrument that a colonial powers used to subjugate, the Africans and the Indians and whoever they were oppressing. So clothing is not just innocent, basically. So one way in which you can do this would be also to document, record, and that's why I cited the example of the film documentary produced by Africa Fashion Week London in association with the First Lady of Kwara State. You can find that film documentary online. It was showcased at the Sustainable Fashion Week in New York in September 2020. And there it talks about traditional textile production, weaving practices, who the weavers are and the techniques that has been adapted. And what's also interesting now is you have a lot of, let's say, diaspora-based brands and designers who would go to Africa or go to some places in Africa and try to, you know, resurrect the old techniques and ways of weaving and old practices, basically. And when they come back to market their brand is then marketed as ethical or authentic African, you know, design or authentic African product. Well, I hope that answers your question. We should keep documenting and recording, and that's one of the significance of technology. It permits us and gives us this opportunity to, you know, all these old traditional practices, this tacit knowledge that has been vilified and hidden, they're now being again resurrected, and that's it.
Yeah, just to add to that, also, I think there is there's some progress. I know when I go to my university gym here in New York, I hear Afro beats being played all the time, and we are about maybe 90% white, and it's not the Black students who are singing and dancing to Afro beats. It's the white students singing and dancing to Afro beats. So again, that's one way in which we are reclaiming our culture. And we are trying to market our culture without it being appropriated in ways that our artists aren't benefiting from it. And we can do this in different sectors. We don't necessarily need to seek the validation of our former colonizers or the validation of those I might describe as Euro-American white supremacist powers for us to be successful in what we do. We hear the word decolonization being thrown around a lot now. I don't think what we need is decolonization, is revolution, right? That's what we really, really need in order for us to reclaim these spaces, these pre-colonial spaces, this pre-colonial culture, and to also benefit from this culture as well.
All right, Chilanga just asked a question in the chat box, but I've been trying to reach her. I don't know if she's on. Are you on? Chilanga. Okay, she wants to know.
I am.
Okay, all right, she's on. Okay, you can ask your question.
It was more of an observation than just following up on Deirdre's comment. I was just wondering if there's a time frame to indigenous or indigeneity, because you find that maybe certain peoples haven't been living in a certain area for such a long time. They could have been there for maybe 500 years. So are they the people who are indigenous to that area, or what exactly do we follow?
Okay,
That's
so
what
it's
my
like
question.
taken from the Sans people. Is it like from the Sans people and then other clans come take over the same site? So you want to know as far back we want to go, right?
Yes.
Okay, over to you, panelists.
I think, well, I think that makes a point I've been trying to make, because of our migration. Very difficult, you know. How far do you go to say certain people are indigenous to that particular area? That's why I have a problem with the word and how it's defined.
Okay. This takes me. Yeah. I think this takes us back to something about what historians have called a deep past. Most historians in Africa, especially, I think this book was edited by Peter Schmidt and one other person. It is titled The Death of Prehistory. So in that book, they have argued for what they call deep past. Instead of applying prehistory, history, and whatever in Africa, that in Africa, you cannot use these concepts because people lived in a cultural continuum, and you can't break the past from the present. So I think it is problematic to begin to apportion historical phases in Africa where people are living in a continuum. I think I've also made this argument in recent publication I made in International Journal of Heritage Studies, where I've argued that people do not, especially in these localities, people look at their culture based on the way their ancestors have lived, and they take it from generation to generation. I've explained from Igbo perspective some concepts that they use to manage this historical continuity. And it is difficult to begin to say that this happened in during prehistory or during history or whatsoever. So I think it is difficult to apply such concepts in Africa because of our peculiarities. So that's what I have to say.
All right, thank you. So I would like to thank Anne Hanoff about the grants. She put a link to documenting practices, and she said there's a call out at the moment. So thank you, Anne, for that. I will just be rounding up because I can see that we only have 4 minutes left. And a big thank you to all our panelists who were here today. And Marika, yes, you should have said something. Marika, do you want to say something now before I round up?
Yes, I can. I put it in the chat, but I just want to say I'm speaking from a South African representative. Although my skin color is not is different, but I represent a community that's formed over many years from the colonial past, and although it comes from that context, we're past that with a few years, and I identify 100% as being African and living in Africa, and I can't go anywhere else. And I just want to say that I wonder if there's a way forward where we move forward instead of looking too much back. I'm not sure if I'm falling over my words, but I just that I say that if I lived 100, if history took a step perhaps 100 years back or forward, my profile might have been completely different. I might have been speaking Portuguese or Swahili even. And from the conversation, it sounds like many movements has occurred in Africa as well. And perhaps just a bit of context from that side. And I was wondering, in terms of ecology, if you look at plants, they often described as being indigenous. And indigenous, in terms of ecology, refers to a plant that grows in a specific area, but it can also occur on another continent. Maybe it's an interesting. It won't fit into this discussion, but it might be an interesting parallel just to refer back to. And then there's a word in terms of ecology that we describe as endemic, and endemic being from one specific valley and it occurs nowhere else in the world. And those are the elements that you really need to be protecting. But then being indigenous, in that sense, I would refer to myself as being indigenous to Africa, especially because of the mix of cultures. I occur nowhere else in the world. So I just wanted to raise that. But a great conversation.
All right, thanks, Marika. And I can see that the time is going quickly, and Anne wants to say something, so I will let Anne speak quickly, and then we can go.
Oh, hi. Hello, thank you very much. No, it's a quick point. I'm an archaeologist, and I'm sure John and others here would agree with me that when you start bringing in history and wanting to know, how far back we want to go, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I just wanted to say that every time we go and excavate somewhere, people are very keen to say, who was here first? Which group was here first? And as I think John said, you cannot identify social communities or ethnic groups in the archaeological record, and it quickly becomes also very political very quickly. That's all I wanted to say. I know we're short on time. Thank you for the very interesting discussion.
Okay, so I'll let the ICOMOS, thank you, Anne, sorry, I'm conscious of the time now. I'll let ICOMOS president say a few words if he can. And then a big thank you to our global audience and to our panelists. And I'll let the ICOMOS Nigeria president give us the last vote of thanks or something.
Okay. Okay. Hello, am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Should I talk now? Should I speak?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for the challenges I've been having with my network, but just a quick point. I've been very interested in this issue of the indigeneity, especially in relation to the context of the pastoral Fulanis here, who are always on constant migration throughout the range of West Africa. So I think it will be a very interesting topic, very, of course, problematic for this group of people who are on constant movement across the West African region. And there's, I don't know how the issue of indigeneity will apply, especially in terms of their sense of place, where the whole region seems to be a place for their, you know, for their movement in terms of their pastoralism. Also to finally, of course, I know time is over, but to really appreciate this theme that has been put here, that has been discussed. It's very, very enriching, very deep, very incisive. And I want to thank each and every one of you, the panelists and all those that have participated in this very enriching discussion. I wish to thank every one of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I've been told that we'll have a part 2 because this was so deep. So there'll be another one next year. I hope you're all getting ready, all your facts and your presentations. And I look forward to seeing everyone next year for the part 2, apparently, of this session. All right, thank you everyone for attending. And I look forward to seeing each and every one of you. And thank you to our global audience as well. Thank you, ICOMOS Nigeria, for letting us host this, and see you guys in 2021 when the world is feeling a bit better. All right, thanks. All right, bye.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.